podcast includes commentary and conversations about issues relevant to clinical psychology. It is intended to educate, entertain, and enlighten, and is not a substitute for actual mental health treatment. Individuals who share personally here choose willingly to tell their stories to benefit you, the listener. All other references to clinical situations are altered or limited to protect confidentiality. For more specific questions or help with a personal situation, please consult a local mental health professional. Therapy, mental health, real life. This is Psych Rally with Los Angeles-based clinical psychologist Dr. Martin Hsia.
All right, here we are for episode 23. Welcome back. It's just me this time. And, well, we are living in some very tenuous times, you can put it that way. We're about a couple weeks into our current White House administration. There's been some very controversial decisions. It looks like all kinds of drama going on over cabinet picks and lobbies back and forth about executive orders. There's an immigration ban, regulation cuts, Russia controversy, just lots of tension in the air. And, lots of anxiety. In the meantime, one of my more advanced professional certifications is as a diplomate with the Academy of Cognitive Therapy, which is based out of Philadelphia and is founded on the principles and work of Dr. Aaron Beck. And the ACT Academy of Cognitive Therapy is an association which trains and certifies therapists internationally with a certain degree of competence in cognitive and cognitive behavior therapy. Recently, on the Academy's listserv, a colleague there, Dr. John Lawrence, he is a professor at the College of Staten Island in New York. He posed some really interesting questions to the group. And, the gist of it is, okay, we're in a heightened sense of anxiety, politically, there's a lot of uncertainty in social events. Does cognitive behavior therapy have any role? Now, some members on the listserv were not so happy about this. They said, hey, this is a professional listserv and politics should be kept out of it. And, whoever's moderating these emails should have intervened in some fashion. And, then there's other people who said, well, of course there's a need to talk about politics. It affects what we do as professionals and both us personally and certainly features among the people that we help, our clients. And what this reminds me of is years ago when I was working at a veterans hospital, there was a time when I was leading a therapy group for veterans dealing with depression, depression management group. And I was co-facilitating the group. It met once a week. I had a co-facilitator who was a fellow psychologist. And naturally, all the veterans in the group were there dealing with some form of depression. And many of the vets in the group were also dealing with post-traumatic stress disorder resulting from, experiences they had had in combat. And I remember this one time when one veteran started talking about in group how he wasn't sleeping well. He was having nightmares. He, was having heightened anxiety and hypervigilance in crowds and social situations, pretty classic PTSD symptoms. And my co-therapist kind of cut him off and said, whoa, you remember, this is a group for dealing with depression. We're here to support one another and learn ways to cope more effectively with depression. It's not a PTSD group. So, we're not here to talk about trauma. And if that's what you're looking for, we gotta find you a different group for that. And I just remember thinking, okay, yes, the focus in this group and the common theme for everyone here and everyone that we're helping with in this group is their depression. And sure, not everyone here may have PTSD, and some people certainly may not want to hear about other people talking about trauma. But at the same time, things they really don't always compartmentalize that cleanly or that easily, right? And for this poor gentleman, his chronic sleep disruption, his anxiety, his reactivity, which had damaged multiple relationships for him, in many ways, a lot of which was resulting from his trauma, were so much a part of why he was depressed and isolated and feeling hopeless. And I really just felt in that moment, a very significant and relevant part of this man's experience, and certainly a relevant part of his depression, was kind of shut down and missed. So, all that to say is, in many instances, is there a time and place to talk about one thing and not another? Sure, but it's not always that black or white. And Fortunately in this incident on the listserv, many colleagues on the listserv sort of came out in defense of John Lawrence for bringing it up. And they're saying, this is, we're not here on this professional listserv saying who voted for who. We're not saying who's right and who's wrong. We're not demonizing any party or point of view. We're here because politics is bringing up anxiety for many people. And there's genuine distress in the lives of people we're trying to help. And here we are, it's a professional community and a helping profession trying to talk about what role we can serve in people's lives when their rights or freedoms are in jeopardy or feeling threatened. So, it's a political issue, but we weren't talking about political views, so I think as far as I'm concerned, it was relevant for the listserv insofar as it was clinically relevant, which nobody seemed to disagree with. So, I think when it comes to difficult issues and certainly when it comes to emotional issues in psychology, it's not always neat. It's not always organized in clean compartments. And in fact, you could probably argue it rarely is, right? For the depression doesn't happen in isolation. We can all feel depressed. Someone can feel depressed because of political circumstances, because of a breakup, a medical diagnosis, because of PTSD, or for any multitude or combination of those reasons, and maybe for no particular reason in and of itself. So life is messy. Things affect one another, and I think we can do a lot of damage to ourselves and to people around us when we shut important conversations down. And we need to accept and embrace that reality. Clean categories, sound nice in theory, but they really don't hold up. So getting back to Dr. Lawrence's original question, I think there's kind of two main points he brought up in his email. I'll summarize the first, and basically he says cognitive behavior therapy, especially in the case of anxiety, when applied to anxiety disorders, is generally geared towards helping individuals cope with a misperceived level of threat for anxiety. At least that's sort of the rationale. And these are Dr. Lawrence's own words. He wrote, "The CBT model hypothesizes that in anxiety disorders, people tend to overestimate a threat and underestimate their ability to cope." So, a couple examples that come to mind. Say, a woman avoids driving on the freeway because she once had a panic episode while driving on that stretch, and she's pretty certain that she'll have another panic episode if she drives there again, and she's worried it's going to be equally devastating just as the first time. Or, say, for a young man with OCD, contamination type. His hands are dried and cracked and bleeding at the joints because for himself, he's really built up this fear that eating even a small snack without washing his hands with 12 lathers of soap was going to result in him contracting illness. So, this one part of him has become convinced that the likelihood of that happening is really, really greater than it probably is. And he's just convinced he's not going to be able to handle whatever anxiety comes up if he does that without washing. So, there's so many ways in which that illustrates this idea with cognitive behavior therapy, that traditionally that's how we view it. The likelihood of a threat is inflated and the perceived ability to handle it is underestimated. But, this gets back to political circumstances at this time. What if the threat is accurately perceived or appraised? What if the threat that I'm anxious about is real? What if it's now true that I'm more likely to have my civil rights violated or be discriminated against? What if it's now true that myself and my kids are more at risk of being exposed to the dangers of war or nuclear attacks? What if it's now true that my economic future or opportunities are more in jeopardy, or that, I live in a world that's more in danger due to climate change and policies that deregulate and accelerate that danger? I think this is the question that Dr. Lawrence raises. It's not an overestimated threat. It might be an accurately understood threat. This is a great question because you could make the case that traditional cognitive therapy, which is about, helping people question and challenge and think about their ways of thinking that may be unhealthy, black and white thinking, catastrophizing. We're trying to help people be more realistic and think in ways that are more balanced and more helpful. But what happens if, again, reality lines up more with what someone actually fears? And there are actual figures and forces and institutions that are making, monumental decisions which are out of our control. That premise with traditional cognitive therapy kind of doesn't seem so helpful here. Or how about even more traditional behavior therapy? Say exposure therapy, exposure with response prevention. When we have someone confront a thought or a place or an object that they may have an inflated fear of, well, we can talk about a real fear or have them do it in an effort to confront it and with the hope of that fear coming down. But what if the source of that actual fear remains? So there are limitations there. And from that angle, traditional cognitive and traditional behavior therapy, you could make the case, not so helpful there, kind of limited. Now, this to me, taking it a step further, it's completely interrelated with the second issue Dr. Lawrence raised in his email to the listserv, which is that, the question of, does cognitive behavior therapy have any role or benefit when it comes to social and political issues? Clearly, we know that it does in helping people at a personal level with individual issues, anxiety, depression, what have you. Well, what about global and collective issues? Does cognitive behavior therapy have any role? And Dr. Lawrence wrote in his own words, quote, in the CBT model, usually the threat is at the individual level. For example, a heart attack, fearing a heart attack, fearing social rejection or loss of a job. It's not so much at the societal or environmental level. So, my first thought on this goes to the Serenity Prayer. And if you don't know, aren't familiar with that, it's used in many settings, but it's the idea of asking to God or higher power, or what have you, for the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things that I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. So people might know this is common to, the 12-step and the AA tradition. And, basically what it speaks to is there's this continuum between change and acceptance. The action of changing something or taking steps to do something differently versus accepting it the way it is. And both of which are very powerful ways of relating to a difficult or undesired situation. Again, you can make the case traditional CBT is more about change. But I think what speaks to this dilemma is the newer, what we call third wave behavior therapies, acceptance and commitment therapy or ACT, and dialectical behavior therapy or DBT, which really integrate the powerful concept of acceptance, not just about change, but acceptance. And I'll say a little bit more as to why they really, go hand in hand. Now, when they say acceptance in these new approaches to therapy, it doesn't just mean you give up when you don't like something, when something's difficult. It doesn't mean you don't do anything. You just lie down and accept it. That's not what acceptance means. It's more about, okay, we acknowledge and embrace the situation as it is, as reality. Even if it's unwanted or if it's difficult. And in that way, it engenders flexibility. It helps us improve our ability to tolerate a difficult situation or a difficult emotion, a difficult experience. And in turn, it creates options and awareness for us to take committed action or to mobilize in some way. DBT uses the term radical acceptance. Similarly, that it's not that something that we fear or that is difficult is okay, but only once you've really accepted something as reality, do you really have sort of the emotional and cognitive resources and flexibility freed up to move forward, to make a decision, to find a way to cope differently with a difficult situation. I'm hoping to have coming up Dr. Gordon Hall of the University of Oregon as a guest here on Psych Rally. And he wrote a great article, which I'll link to here. He wrote a great article on mindfulness and how it's been adapted to the Western world, which is different from its Eastern roots. Now, the heritage of mindfulness and sort of accepting, non-judgmental, present awareness is not separated from an individual's identity as part of a society. Mindfulness in that context, and its more Eastern roots, serves a collective, a more collaborative purpose in that sense. How do we reflect on compassion for other people and for those around us? And mindfulness meditation, mindfulness-based therapies as they've been adapted in the U.S. and in the Western world, in many ways you could say have been applied in a way that's more personal and more internal. And, I think reflecting on the theme of acceptance, there's a lot of overlap with mindfulness. And we do well to see those concepts from a broader and more historical perspective. And Dr. Hall's article kind of speaks to that. I'm also reminded, there was a great book we read in graduate school by Philip Cushman, which it was all about the history of psychotherapy in the 20th century, and specifically within the context of American historical events in the 20th century. And what he really talks about is how in the post-war world, post-war U.S., the culture of consumerism really led society to locate the self within the individual, rather than as fundamentally social or relational in nature, or even created between individuals. Cushman even argues that the history of psychoanalysis in the U.S. has colluded with historical developments and consumerism, so that psychotherapy has over time really reinforced a view of the individual as separate from its social context. And the emphasis has been on the individual and its internal world, kind of more divorced of its collective, of our collective associations. And perhaps it's us. It's our profession and our professional ancestors that are partially to blame for this. So, there was a time and place, and perhaps an opportunity, that the field of psychotherapy had to remain more engaged and more relevant to social and political circumstances. But over time has, in general, kind of stayed focused on the individual, on the internal. And I think to some extent, the language that the third wave behavior therapies use is maybe a move back in that direction. Acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT, talks about confronting things that we fear, not just to reduce fear or to confront it, but to increase psychological flexibility, to increase a breadth of repertoire. And I read into that, the hope that we can help people open doors, increase options for handling a situation or for taking action, even in the face of fear and anxiety. I do think at the same time, sometimes talking about broad societal and political issues is kind of a subtle way to avoid something for ourselves at a more personal level. It's like we can talk about something that's going on in the news instead of looking in the mirror, because sometimes that's hard. And, this isn't sort of the worst way, perhaps, to deflect from our more internal struggles and issues. It's not destructive in the way a substance might be, but, it can kind of be a more covert way in which we protect ourselves from looking at something difficult or confronting a feeling that we're worried is going to be too difficult to handle, or even from doing hard work in therapy, right? So, we all might have some people in our lives, who knows a lot about things and can talk about the news and knowledge and politics, but you kind of feel like you don't really know them, right? And while I'm certainly not saying it's not important to be engaged with, what's going on in the world, I think sometimes, we kind of need to be wary of getting too caught up and not working on ourselves. But, overall, I think with all of the unrest and the division and the anxiety, at least here in the U.S. at a time like this, there's a direction to lean towards for a lot of people. Perhaps it's toward the outward, towards engagement. And Dr. Lawrence's challenge to the listserv really raised the great question about to what degree psychotherapy is focused on the individual's internal world versus the broader picture in which an individual is part of a society and may have an outward role that needs to be tended to and nurtured. I really, at the end of the day, in some way, I think all therapy should be about empowering those that come to change in some way for the better. And at times like these, I see people managing and channeling their anxiety and their anger towards engagement in social issues. I see it a lot, by calling politicians, by sharing articles on social media, and posting thoughts, by organizing, by attending marches. These are actions that may not be written about explicitly in a CBT workbook or a journal, but, I think seem to be a natural outpouring of the current sentiments. And to the extent that these are committed actions that arise from someone's values, I see therapy as a place to explore and encourage. Now, of course, for those that aren't unhappy with current administration and policy decisions and leadership appointments, if those are your values, and therapy isn't a place to challenge those values, perhaps. But for the many people that are questioning and challenging, speaking up about political issues, therapy is definitely a place to explore avenues for empowerment and positive action. Last thing I'll say, just to kind of drive this point home, is I'm sort of at the stage of life when, due to having young kids, I kind of watch the movie Frozen a lot more than I would otherwise if I didn't have kids. And, recently I thought, we've seen it so many times, a lot of times we put it on and I kind of check out that's the time to clean the kitchen or whatever. Maybe I'll practice what I preach and really be mindful with the film, which otherwise I'd love to do, and sit down with my films and really pay attention to what's going on. And, I found myself really struck by, there's a duet in Frozen that maybe the two sisters, Anna and Elsa, they're singing on Coronation Day. It's for the first time in forever. And there's this great scene where Anna, the younger sister, is full of excitement and hope. And for the first time in forever, it's going to be dancing and chocolate and handsome men. And then comes Elsa's part. And there's fear and dread. Don't let them see, conceal, don't feel, put on a show. There's this secret she has to hide. And I was actually quite moved by the sort of interplay and the disparity between these two sisters when I watched that scene again, with an open heart and an open mind. Some people are feeling paralyzed by fear at this time and in this period of major transition and uncertainty. And, I think in the face of any situation, once you can accept that this is the truth, this is the reality you're presented with, it creates the potential to move towards hope and empowerment and love. And you see that in Anna. You don't see it in Elsa. And there's this verse actually in the Christian tradition that talks about how perfect love casts out all fear. And I know I'm taking that out of context, but I very much see that principle play out psychologically. When we act from a mindset or a place of love and hope, there's just a lot less room for fear and for anger. So, for those who are going through a time of suffering and anxiety due to our political climate, and all the possibilities that may affect you adversely or affect us adversely in a real way, if we really look around, there are models and inspirations throughout our culture and in history that can inspire you to move to a place of empowered acceptance, from fear to hope, from paralysis to action. And, and therapy, at least some approaches to cognitive behavior therapy, do have something to say about that. If we really broaden and take a big picture, longitudinal perspective, there have been plenty of other crises and world wars and cold wars and missile crises. In so many ways, let's remember that there is not much new under the sun. And when we really let anxiety rule us, we stop living. So, an encouragement to really stay in hope and love and passion for what each of us believe to be right, because that's what brings about change from each of us, even in the face of scary times. Production of Psych Rally's been slower of late, admittedly. Just a lot of side projects here at CBT SoCal where I work, but I so appreciate y'all listening in, keeping me on my toes. As usual, I will post some links on the show notes at psychrallypodcast.com, and I welcome your feedback and comments there as always. Thank you for listening in and staying engaged. We'll catch you next time in the rally.